Coming up on today's show, the end of an era, Pirates Ponzi meets the SEC. Mining malware in the wild, Andreas goes in depth and conducts his first interview on Let's Talk Bitcoin. How big is the malware problem anyways? Does it matter? Oh heck, KNC wants to create a hashing power cartel. All this and more on Let's Talk Bitcoin. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show focused on the ideas, projects, and people building the new digital economy and the future of money. We've turned the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit into a place for listeners to do some of the prep work for us by submitting topics, questions, or comments. We're going to try and use this as much as possible, and submissions with more upvotes from other listeners will make it onto the show much faster than sending an email. To participate, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/reddit. That's REDDIT. Or visit the Let's Talk Bitcoin, all one word, subreddit. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Joining me in our twice-weekly search for clarity, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in distributed systems and decentralized networks.
Hello.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hey guys, does the name Pirate at 40 ring a bell?
This has been a story that's been going around for quite a while. It's interesting to see it finally get resolved here. Now, why don't you tell us about it, Stephanie?
This is a name that I haven't heard for, maybe over a year. Maybe our listeners remember if they've been interested in Bitcoin for a while. There used to be an organization called Bitcoin Savings and Trust, and it was run by this person who went by the name Pirate or Pirate at 40 on the Bitcoin Talk forum. And what this person was promising was basically like you invest Bitcoins with them and you would get crazy returns. I think it was like 6% a week, something on that order. Just nuts. Even though his name was Pirate and he was promising some kind of returns on Bitcoins that seemed relatively crazy, a lot of people gave him Bitcoins. It turned out to be a scam. He basically took the money and ran at some point.
No.
Yeah, say it ain't so. And yeah, I guess what do you expect from somebody named Pirate who's promising you outrageous returns on your Bitcoins? But yeah, that's exactly what happened. And people were mad. And I even saw some discussions. I remember at the time seeing some discussions on the Bitcoin Talk forum about getting together like a bounty to like find this guy and hire a hitman or something like that, because people were so angry at this guy. And they said, how can we actually get justice? Apparently, it's not so much outside of the legal system anymore, because this person has been found and charged by the SEC, actually, which is the, Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. So he's from Texas. The headline is, the Securities and Exchange Commission today charged a Texas man and his company with defrauding investors in a Ponzi scheme involving Bitcoin. The SEC alleges that Trendon T. Shavers, who is the founder and operator of Bitcoin Savings and Trust, offered and sold Bitcoin-denominated investments through the internet using monikers Pirate and Pirate at 40. Shavers raised at least 700,000 Bitcoins in Bitcoin Savings and Trust investments, which amounted to more than 4.5 million based on the average price of Bitcoin in 2011 and 2012, when the investments were offered and sold. Today, the value of 700,000 Bitcoins exceeds 60 million. So this guy would have made out like a pirate, literally, if he hadn't been caught. The SEC alleges that Shavers promised investors up to 7% weekly interest based on Bitcoin Savings and Trust's market arbitrage activity, which supposedly included selling to individuals who wish to buy Bitcoin, quote, off the radar in quick fashion or large quantities. In reality, it was a scam and a Ponzi scheme in which Shavers used Bitcoin from new investors to make purported interest payments and cover investor withdrawals on investments. Shavers also diverted investors' Bitcoin for day trading in his own account on a Bitcoin currency exchange and exchanged investors' Bitcoin for US dollars to pay his own personal expenses. So basically, he's like Bernie Madoff of Bitcoin. Yeah, now that he's been caught, there are people who are speculating that the US government or the SEC may be controlling, at this point, a huge amount of Bitcoins. Have you guys heard anything about this? What do you think?
I think it's really good that the SEC is protecting us after the fact by ensuring that the only people who can run Ponzi schemes are either the Federal Reserve or properly organized and licensed Ponzi scheme operators out of Wall Street.
Yeah, he just wasn't friends with the right people, this pirate at 40.
Yeah, I know. And the funny thing is, if only he had held, right? If only instead of Ponziing it up, he had held, he would have been able to pay back that return and more to his investors. That's the hilarious part of this.
The thing that jumps out at me about this is I'm surprised the SEC chose to get involved. Because it's not like, you mentioned that he's been caught. That really actually wasn't the case. When the Ponzi looked like it was a Ponzi about a year ago, that name started floating around, and the companies that he had previously been associated with kind of started coming up and circulating through the Bitcoin community in certain parts of it.
So they didn't catch him. So he was already identified before this?
Right, yeah, his identity was identified. But the thing is that...
Oh, gotcha. That's important.
You take this same story and you transpose it onto like Beanie Babies, for example. What if people were investing, quote unquote, in this, in his scheme using Beanie Babies instead of Bitcoins? Would the SEC still be involved? Because to this point, again, we keep going through these cycles where it's not legitimate and then somebody does something that makes it seem like it actually is pretty legitimate, because otherwise they shouldn't be paying attention to it and shouldn't have any jurisdiction over it. So that's the question kind of that keeps coming up to me is, what exactly is Bitcoin in the eyes of the government? What is it in the eyes of these various regulatory bodies?
Don't Beanie Babies have intrinsic value, though?
They exist in the real world. They're real.
I guess. But so
if you're really hungry, you could eat them.
That's, I think, the question that I keep coming back to, though, is what does this all mean in terms of the long-term implications? Pirate, first off, he didn't have a company. I've seen lots of stories referring to this as Bitcoin Savings and Trust, but there wasn't any formal structure for it. I mean, this was literally one guy on the internet, quote unquote, selling things to other guys on the internet for something that nobody thought was money until, fairly recently. So how does it seems like there's a disconnect here between the regulatory actions that we're getting and what the actual understood reality is. Because, I mean, if this is true and the SEC does in fact have jurisdiction over non-formal investments like this in alternative currencies or alternative commodities, then that means that every single one of the Bitcoin stock exchanges out there is totally out of compliance, and that they are, in the eyes of the SEC, regulated by them too. So, I mean, so that's the thing that I look at this and say, okay, well, if the SEC is taking this stance, that has really wide-ranging repercussions, not just on people who have scams like Trendon did, but on all these alternative ownership mechanisms that are used to raise funds for mining ventures, for new technologies, and for things that just, where people are wanting to try out this new funding mechanism. Those things suddenly are regulated, and none of those exchanges are complying at all.
And I wonder if there were some people who got taken or got duped with Bitcoin Savings and Trust who complained to them and said,
yes.
Look, you got to do something.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, exactly. No, we heard lots of people talking about that, but the thought was always that, okay, right, go complain. But again, try it with Beanie Babies. I bet you the SEC laughs you out of the room or doesn't return your calls.
Absolutely. And it's, in another way, it's a good thing, because essentially here we don't have the SEC coming in and telling you a priori what regulations you should follow. But essentially what they're doing here is good old pure enforcement. I don't think there's any question that this was a Ponzi scheme. I don't think there's any question that investors were defrauded. If the SEC is able to go in here and somehow do a somewhat structured unwinding of this, see if any money can be recovered, return some of that money to the original investors and apply the law, well, that's not a bad thing.
Some people apparently did make money out of this. 500,000 Bitcoins in investor withdrawals and purported interest payments?
The people who are in it early made money of it. I mean, that's the thing about a Ponzi scheme is that if you get in really early, exactly, that it's a pretty good deal for you. It's good work if you can find it.
I think the comparison to Madoff, though, is really, really unfair. We're talking about 1,000th of the amount supposedly stolen by Madoff, stolen by Pirate of 40. So no matter what we do in Bitcoin in terms of fraud, we're rank amateurs by comparison to the world or global financial system and the staggering amounts of fraud that are happening there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder when the next bigger Bitcoin scam will be, or if there will be a bigger one. And if there's not, maybe that says something about the legacy banking system and the stock market, and maybe there is actually less potential for fraud because of all these community enforcement mechanisms and because of people being wiser consumers and just the nature of Bitcoin itself in the Bitcoin community.
I think the nature of it really is a key point. The fact that it's non-reversible imposes a certain discipline on the buyer to be more careful about when they send their money because they know they have no recourse. There's no daddy state to come in and help you get your money back. At least not in most cases. I think that implicit understanding changes people's behavior in a way that's positive for Bitcoin.
Andreas, I wanted to ask you about this. One of the other things that the SEC did, in addition to releasing this, about the Ponzi, is they issued a investor warning, an investor alert to people who might potentially want to get involved with Bitcoin, various denominated assets, and basically saying that there is a predilection right now for scams in this particular area. I was wondering what you thought of that. Is that a standard thing for the SEC to do?
Oh dear, that's so funny. This is sorry. We're at Dow 15,000. The banks are stealing $1 trillion a year, and the SEC is warning that Bitcoin has predilections to fraud.
Yeah, when you put it in perspective like that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, listen, standard warnings like this towards investors are a bit like the State Department warning people not to visit Egypt or, warning people not to visit Greece or things like that. Quite honestly, it's just like those warnings. Sure, Greece is dangerous, but have you been to Chicago after dark?
Right. The other thing it mentioned specifically in that alert was this idea of accredited investors, right? So that's something that I've been, talking to a few people about, specifically people who have invested in these Bitcoin stock exchanges. And their point is that if those accredited investor requirements were there, then they wouldn't be allowed to make that type of investment that they've made through these quasi stock exchanges that have popped up in the Bitcoin space. Do you think that there's any validity to this idea of accredited investors versus people of lower net worths who aren't allowed to participate in the system?
I don't know. I'm kind of torn on this one. It's both simultaneously a good idea in that if you don't really have the money to invest, you shouldn't be invested in the most risky things. But at the same time, it's absolutely patronizing, paternalistic. And of course, it's also completely arbitrary. So, if you have $500,000 or more, that means you have more sense than someone who has less than $500,000. Quite honestly, I've known shrewd investors who have less money, and I've known trustafarians who have a lot more and not a brain cell in their head. So I don't think really that distinction really means anything. And I would be reluctant to start adding kind of irrelevant distinctions and these kind of paternalistic controls to the Bitcoin space to simulate what really has failed to protect people from fraud in the straight economy. Because here's the thing. As soon as you've run out of accredited investors to fleece, you start fleecing homeowners who don't need to be qualified. And then you steal from their mortgages. So the homeowners weren't accredited investors, and they managed to buy into some tremendously risky assets in the form of these mortgages. So essentially, this isn't really working, at least not if the idea is to protect consumers from excess risk.
I think the other thing, of course, to take away from this, and we'll just end this topic on this note, I think, is Bitcoin, whether it's regulated or unregulated, is still a really risky space to operate in. And so any time that you see something that has the appearance of being too good to be true, then it probably is. And that may not always be true. There may be exceptions, but you really, really need to do your homework. Obvious scam is obvious, right? So, Ponzis look like Ponzis because they're Ponzis. The point is that we need to be very, very skeptical as participants in the new digital economy when looking at any of these things, because a lot of the systems that are there to protect us simply aren't there. Now, whether or not those systems work in real life to protect us is a completely different matter, but the fact that they're simply not present here is, I think, very important to keep in mind moving forward.
I'm not sure really that the presence or not makes such a big difference. Honestly, I think it's important to look at the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. You look at Bitcoin, it has very high perceived risk. No one is walking into Bitcoin thinking Bitcoin is a safe investment. I don't think anybody tells you that Bitcoin is a safe investment. I think it's fairly obvious to all from the get-go that Bitcoin is a risky investment. Now, that's fine because there the appearance matches the reality. What I would be more concerned about is when you walk into a seemingly rock-solid safe investment, like a mortgage or a student loan, and then realize that that investment has the same risk as an over-leveraged derivative. that's a problem. And so I don't think we need more regulation to make obviously risky investments be obviously risky. I think, if anything, what we've seen is a failure of regulation to protect people when they're obviously safe investments in things like student loans and mortgages and depositor accounts are being assailed by these predatory banks in a way that doesn't reveal the underlying risk. So yeah, Bitcoin's risky, but everybody knows that. We don't need to regulate it more just so that people know it's risky. I'd be more worried about the things that are risky, but nobody's talking about.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news. It's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
We've been hearing a lot lately about botnets and their use in mining. Basically, the idea is that if you compromise a number of machines, you can use the CPUs in order to do low-level mining of Bitcoin, but if you multiply that with enough machines, you could actually generate a small profit. We saw this where Rogue Employee distributed malware inside a game and used the GPUs to mine. And last week, I spoke to Panagiotis, a system administrator from Greece who discovered some malware and did some very interesting forensic analysis on it. So let's hear what he had to say. Recently, we've been talking about malware and the possibility of using botnets to mine for Bitcoin. Joining us today, we have someone who will talk to us a bit about malware mining. Hello.
Hello.
Do you want to tell us your name?
My name is Panagiotis Dimotikalis. Quite strange, I think. It's Greek.
Yes, indeed. So that makes two of us with unpronounceable names on the show simultaneously. It might cause problems with the internet, but let's see. Tell me a bit about how you first came across the mining malware that you discovered.
So as an IT consultant, I was asked a couple of weeks ago by a company to check some Windows workstations that were behaving strangely. They were not responding. They were slow. That kind of stuff. And first thing I did was to check for any rogue software that may be installed on the systems or just be present there. So it was quite obvious that the process called sys32.exe was running on the background, occupying 50% of the CPU cycles. Moreover, it had the child process called abab32.exe, who was trying to connect to the internet from time to time.
And how did you find this? Was it visible in the task manager? Or was it?
It was actually visible. I use a replacement for task manager. It's Mark Rusinovich Process Explorer. It's actually task manager on steroids.
Right. Okay, but it wasn't hiding. It wasn't stealthy. It was
no.
Yeah.
It used a little trick in trying to trick Task Manager especially, but not Process Explorer. And that was the reason why I actually found out the 50% CPU cycle it was consuming.
Okay, so you discovered these two processes.
Yeah. So I proceeded right away to kill both processes. I cleaned the registry entry that was created by them in order to start every time Windows boot. And finally deleted the executables. It was a pretty straightforward process, no complications. I mean, no file permissions problems or files being in use, that kind of stuff. Everything seemed to work okay. I had no complaints from the customer, so I considered the problem solved. But out of curiosity, I kept some samples just to mess with them later, run them on a VM, a virtual machine, just to dig, just in case I find anything interesting or maybe something that I may have overlooked.
Our audience thanks you for that curiosity.
Yeah. And I wasn't expecting to find that much. So the first thing I did was to check the two exist. And since I'm a net platform developer also, I found out that the first one, the sys32.exe, is written in C#. It's not packed nor protected in any way, so it can be disassembled pretty easily with any generic tool used for this kind of purpose.
By packed, you mean the binary itself was not compressed, so you were able to easily disassemble it?
Exactly. From the beginning, it was pretty clear that I was dealing with a process used to fire up a legitimate Bitcoin miner. The ABAB32.exe is actually a legitimate miner by a guy, I can't pronounce his name.
Jeff Garzik, yes. Jeff is one of the core developers, and he's developed a number of mining software. So this is Miner D, which is the CPU mining software by Jeff. So this is used by miners all around the world just to mine on their own computers, right? There's nothing weird about this.
VirusTotal detects Miner D.exe as malware. I mean, it has a detection rate of 10 out of 46 malware antivirus engines.
Oh, so they already classify that particular process as malware, which is interesting because it's a legitimate application, but it's found as malware often enough.
While I was scrolling through the disassembled code of sys32.exe, I was asking myself, I was looking just in case I found something interesting in there. And first thought that came to mind was, okay, you are mining Bitcoins. You are using other people's computers to mine Bitcoins without their knowledge. So you probably want all this mining to go back to you in some way without human interaction. How do you do this?
Follow the money, yes.
Exactly. So I came across a particular function inside the disassembled code, which had the domain name, a port, a username under a miner, and the password for this miner.
No compression, no obfuscation, nothing. Just pure, right there in the code.
Exactly. Embedded in there. First thing I did was to check the domain name, which was not valid at the time I came across this malware. So just to mess with the guy, I registered the domain, just in case he decides to come back to check his miners for any Bitcoins he has probably mined. So now the domain is under my registration. I have registered. So there's no way he can get those Bitcoins back.
So let me ask you, Panayotis, if after registering this domain, did you see any other malware activity directed to that domain? Were other instances of the software trying to connect back?
There wasn't any, but I used the server just for a couple of days, just to check for this particular thing, any IPs that might connect to me, but there was nothing.
So they might be still in the wild, but not during the window that you checked.
Exactly. After registering the domain, just to make sure nothing will go wrong with this particular malware, first thing I did was fire up Google and search for this particular username that the miner was under. Right from the first page, there were two results dealing with Bitcoins and this particular username. The first one was in Bitcoin Talk, and the second one in Litecoin. Two user profiles, actually.
So this led you directly to two user profiles in both of the main forums for Litecoin and Bitcoin. But you said was it mining Litecoin or Bitcoin? Could you tell?
I think it was by Bitcoin. I haven't checked it really. I'm not into Bitcoin. I just started reading about Bitcoin just for this particular reason.
Oh, okay. I see. Very, very interesting. So you're relatively new to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
For those of us who have been in this space a while, this seems strange because mining Bitcoin on a CPU is so unproductive. It would make a lot more sense to be mining Litecoin, but there you go. All right. So you found these two profiles. Then what?
Unfortunately, on Bitcoin Talk, this user had 0 posts, so no information in there. But on the other hand, I found out about you, so it was okay. It was great information still. On Litecoin, there was a single post under this username. It was in a subforum called the Project Development. It was written on the 30th of April, past April, and 4 days later it was edited in a pretty suspicious way. The whole post was replaced with dashes and dots. So the only thing I can make up from this is that someone who had the project under development that he didn't want anyone to know after its completion or something like that.
Ah, interesting. Or they changed their mind and went back and tried to make the post disappear, essentially.
After this, I got back to the password used the miner, which was strangely familiar. The password was Iparcho22, which in Greek means I exist 22. And it was written in Greeklish, which Greeklish is actually Greek words written using the Latin alphabet. So it was another clue that the guy is probably Greek.
So you've got a password that points to a username that seems to be Greek, that points to a specific user with a password that itself indicates at least a basic knowledge of the Greek language. So, okay, the plot thickens.
Yeah. And so next thing I had to do was to optimize the query, in Google, the query about the username of the guy. And actually ask Google to give me results originating from Greek domains only. I mean, I used his username, and I told Google to give me results from originating from Greek domains only. I got everything you can possibly imagine. His name, cell phone number, email address, Skype, occupation, city he's living in, an estimated address, photograph, and the irony, an ad he had put on a forum selling, amongst other things, a USB drive.
Very interesting.
It was actually the first mean of that was how the company was infected in the first place.
Okay, so elaborate a bit on that. You're saying that he was selling a USB drive, and within this, you say that the company where you found the infection was infected by USB drive?
Yeah, exactly. No one from the company bought this particular USB drive. Just, the irony of this ad.
Okay, but the malware was distributed by USB.
USB drive, yeah.
So at the moment, we have no way of knowing whether this was an accidental transmission towards where it was infected, or if this was more broadly distributed, or whether it's still running somewhere on other systems. Is that correct?
Exactly. Unfortunately, since the domain is not online anymore, he's not controlling the domain, probably he has stopped, maybe updated the malware. No idea, I can't tell.
In the meantime, we here at Let's Talk Bitcoin have reached out to this person, or to various contact addresses that we think are related to this person, and we've requested an interview. So let's see how that goes. Tell me a bit about how you came across Bitcoin. You said when you discovered the malware, you didn't know much about Bitcoin. That's a really interesting story.
I have read everything about Bitcoin. I knew what was going on, but I have never mined for Bitcoins or deal with the technical details of the Bitcoin.
So you were familiar, or you're aware of Bitcoin, but you hadn't been involved personally, and then suddenly you discover this malware?
Yep, right.
Very nice. Do you actually own Bitcoin? Are you involved in Bitcoin at the moment?
Right now, I just have a wallet.
Oh, very good. Excellent. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach one of your addresses for donations on the site, perhaps, or something like that.
Okay,
get you started. What else did you discover as part of your research? So what would you say was your end goal here?
I just hate guys who try to manipulate people with not that much of knowledge in computers. I hate malware. I think they're actually thieves on the internet.
So your personal sense of justice was offended, and you needed to see more, and also your sense of curiosity for...
Exactly, yeah.
What kind of advice would you give people who come across perhaps some weird symptoms on their systems? Well, what should they be looking out for? How do you identify this type of mining malware?
Figure out that something was wrong. It was pretty straightforward, that their computers were slow at any time. It was stuck consuming 50% CPU cycles at all times. So even for people who just use their computers to log into Facebook, I think they will understand that something is sluggish or something is not right. First thing they have to do is fire up a task manager, or even better, Process Explorer. I'm always talking for Windows systems.
This does sound like a Windows problem, that's for sure. So you mentioned there was a slight difference between Task Manager, and,
right,
which is provided by Windows to clarify. And Process Explorer is a third-party tool that's a bit more sophisticated. So what was this malware doing with Task Manager to obfuscate?
There was a particular function that was trying to trick Task Manager, and it was always watching for task ngr.exe. I think it's the executable of Task Manager. I can't remember the name. And every time it saw that Task Manager was running, it immediately idled its execution. When you fired up Task Manager, you could see that it was consuming 0 CPU cycles.
That's really smart. So basically it was playing dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Anytime it's looking this way, play dead. So as soon as you open Task Manager, the malware plays dead, then you close Task Manager and it goes back to using 100% of CPU.
50%.
Or 50% of CPU. Was that because of it was on a multi-core, or was it limited to 50%?
It actually checks how many cores are on the system and decides every time to use half of them with 50% of each one.
Okay, so it's nice. It wants you to still be able to use Windows.
Right.
Which is typical behavior, biologically, a parasitic organization tries to not kill its host, because if it kills its host, it dies also. So it kind of makes sense to keep the infection at a minimum.
Maybe in the next version of the malware, I don't know, an update maybe, he could use the GPU. Not the CPU. I mean, as you said in the beginning, that there is no point of using the CPU.
Yes, and who knows? Perhaps this was simply a test. Perhaps this was simply version 1, the beta. From the experience of this on how to propagate and run the software, the next one's going to be, CG miner or BFG miner, one of the more sophisticated GPU miners. How would you tell if your GPU was being used?
Actually, Process Explorer has a monitoring tool for this also.
So one of the main bits of advice here is don't necessarily trust Task Manager. Use a third-party process monitoring system like Process Explorer.
It's a freeware and everyone can download it.
Has this made you more interested in Bitcoin, or are you a bit annoyed by Bitcoin out of this experience? Or has it changed your mind at all?
No, it hasn't changed my mind. But the only problem is that my hardware is quite old. I have only one GPU, a quite old CPU, and I'm out of luck regarding Bitcoin mining.
Unless you use somebody else's computers en masse, which is obviously, perhaps that's part of the incentive structure here. Part of the problem is because mining on a single CPU isn't really doing anything. You need thousands of systems to make any serious amount of money. So maybe that's the incentive that drove this person to create this software.
That's my guess.
Yotis, thank you so much for giving us this information and for the excellent analysis you have done. We're going to stay on this story and follow up. Thank you for giving us a glimpse into the world of malware mining for Bitcoin.
Thank you very much, Andreas.
So pretty fascinating stuff we heard from Panagiotis there. After that interview, I reached out to the person supposedly distributing this malware based on the information I found on the forums and sought to conduct an interview. Those requests are still going out, and I still have hope that he will be talking to us on the show at some point. But as of now, we have no comment, and so we'll have to, unfortunately, leave it at that. So what do you guys think about the idea of people distributing CPU miners inside malware?
Because it took so long, because it seems like this was something that was dead by the time it was found, I wonder if this wasn't being used at a time where CPU mining was still viable. Because CPU mining has, over the last 2 years, become kind of obsoleted, but we don't really know when these systems were infected or when this person was really active in the space.
That's a really good point. This could be malware that's been sitting there for a couple of years and was only discovered recently. It would be interesting to look at which particular version of the Miner D mining software was in there. That would give us an earliest date possible.
I was thinking the exact same thing about, how long had this been sitting there until it was discovered? And I was also thinking, as sort of an accompaniment to that, how common is this? How many companies have computers that are just sitting there mining Bitcoins and nobody has any idea? And, maybe it's not such a huge deal anymore because CPU mining, as you said, Adam, is kind of obsolete. But I'm curious, if you just took a random sample of a couple thousand computers at just different companies and maybe schools and things like that, how many of them would be running Bitcoin mining malware?
So the answer in general is it's estimated between 4 and 8% of systems running Windows in commercial environments have been compromised. That means they're running some kind of rootkit, Trojan, or malware system permanently.
That's it? 4 to 8%?
4 to 8% is it's an enormous number for several 10 million computers out there. Keep in mind that most of the time, monetizing the processing power and memory of these systems is not easy. So in most cases, they're rented out, and they're rented out to people who can generate money with these botnets. And usually that involves spam. And so if you have an average click-through rate on spam that's in the, 0.000% click-through rate, and you're able to make a few sales, it's not a very lucrative monetization scheme. I can see that mining, whether Bitcoin mining on GPUs or perhaps Litecoin mining as well, would be a much fast path to monetization. And if you take that for granted and there are tens of millions of machines out there, it makes sense. It's only a matter of time before those who've compromised them figure out there's a better way to make money.
Of that 4 to 8% of computers out there that are compromised, definitely most of them are not going to be mining Bitcoin.
Right now, probably none or very few of them. Most of them are probably running spamming malware, which is the most common monetization scheme. But the nice thing is that many of these malware systems are upgradable, so they will just upload a new payload and a new set of task directives to the compromised systems. They're all remote controlled. It wouldn't be surprising to start seeing some of these being converted to malware miners.
Is this even evil? I mean, most of the time when you talk about malware, it's being used for purposes like you said, like spam. That's the monetization that's available because you're not able to actually monetize the CPU itself, because you're not able to monetize the hardware itself. Instead, you just use it as another arm, on the multi-armed octopus, so to speak, throwing, spam out into the system. With Bitcoin, again, you're talking about computers that are basically drone computers. And in this situation, they were noticed eventually as being slightly sluggish. But when you interviewed the gentleman before, he said that, that the miner intentionally was only taking 50% of the CPU. So with that in mind, for basic office tasks, that might not even be noticeable under a lot of circumstances. So does it matter?
I think that's the goal, really. It's kind of the biology of a parasite is to protect the host, because if the host dies, the parasite dies too. So keeping your mining under 50% so that the host doesn't notice is kind of a sensible precaution. But think of it from a different perspective. If you're a business and you have 10,000 computers, you have 40 or 50 of these machines compromised with a miner, and they're running 24/7 for a year consuming electricity, I would say that's theft. Absolutely. I'm paying for that electricity. I would say that's theft. Now, evil, that's really a completely other issue. I reserve words evil for people who institute torture regimes, for example, not for people who steal a bit of electricity. But then again, in today's society, we call those people vice president. We call these people hackers.
This seemed like it was pretty restricted to kind of a Greek ecosystem. When I was listening to the interview, it seemed to me almost like this could have been like a trial run or a test, that somebody could have just gone to kind of a local place. I know that, Greece is not small, but comparably speaking, you could just go in and infect a couple of companies like this if you had some sort of access either through a job or working with the companies in other ways.
Yeah, he's an IT guy, and that makes it more evil, right?
Right.
It seems that the perpetrator here has an IT career. If that's true, then obviously they're exploiting their professional position in a way their clients obviously don't know they are.
Right. So then it really becomes, again, if it's something that's not super noticeable, yeah, you're right, it's still theft, but you can see how the proportion of people who might be interested in this and who might have overlap with the opportunity with it, really, it's almost a no-risk scenario for them. The chances of being caught are small, and the chances of it being understood if you are caught are even smaller.
Well, I could tell you, this guy was caught and nothing's going to happen.
Right, exactly.
It's the proof is right here. And it's not just because this is Greece and, who knows how to even start proceedings like this in Greece. I don't think it would have been much different story if this was happening here.
Right. It just seems like there isn't much actionable that can be done. Sure, there might be small breaches of the law that have actually occurred, and you could certainly try and, make one of those work to accomplish your larger goals. But as far as the actual act itself being illegal, besides the fact that it's tampering with someone else's computer and installing unauthorized software, there just isn't much here.
No, but what I'm interested about is the incentive structure, because if you assume that this incentive structure exists, that cryptocurrencies will become the dominant form of monetization on botnet mining, that in turn will create a more profitable botnet mining scheme, which will lead to spreading more Trojans and malware in order to compromise more systems. So the bad news here is that this takes an existing war of malware and escalates it by funding the adversary, essentially, with large amounts of money coming from cryptocurrency mining. It makes monetization simple, just like it makes monetization simple for us selling content or for building an e-commerce site. It also empowers hackers to make monetization of stolen machines simple. And that means it's going to happen again and again and more until pretty much you can assume that every relative you know who's not computer savvy is running a Bitcoin miner. Grandma's mining!
She doesn't even know it.
She doesn't even know it.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com. EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB. KNC Miner is a company that is selling ASICs on pre-order. ASIC miners, are a very fast way to buy Bitcoins, and a lot of companies have been selling ASIC miners on pre-order, but there have been some issues with those because sometimes pre-orders, which is why they're pre-orders, don't meet the specifications, don't come out in the time that they're promised to come out in, and things like that. KNC Miner, on the other hand, seems to be pretty serious. They are on track with their schedule that they've set out to their customers to start shipping their units in this year in September. They're going to have their first shipment in September. Apparently they're ready to go. And these are very powerful miners. These are going to be the most powerful units out there on the market, assuming everything goes well and they get them out there. And they've released a statement about their plan. It's called their network protection statement. So I wanted to talk about that with you guys because I think that's a really interesting thing. Here's their statement. At KNC Miner, we are aware of the service we're providing to our customers. We are also aware that we need our customers to have a return on their devices in order to purchase from us again. With the scale of the supply chain factories that we have access to, we need to be cautious we don't ship too many devices and therefore reduce the return to our customers. So with that in mind, our plan is to do as follows. And remember, they don't say this in the statement, but I'm just going to break in here and say that they plan to ship their first shipment in September, coming up here in just a few months. So they're going to start shipping in September and maybe ship in September and October with their first batch there. And then they say, we will ship no devices in December 2013, January 2014, or February 2014. Meaning that once we have taken the difficulty up at the end of November, we will not release any more hashing power for 3 months. We will then release our new generation of devices, which will begin shipping in March 2014. These devices will also have a much higher gigahash per dollar rating than any of our current offerings. We would like to state that if any of our competitors continues to add large amounts of hashing power to the network during December, January, or February, we will continue to release our device as competitively priced as we can to protect our customers' share of the network. Thanks, KNC Miner team. So basically, what they're doing is planning a strategic distribution of their devices, which are going to be very powerful devices, no doubt are going to affect the hashing power of the Bitcoin network. And some people, are really going to profit from these. But the question is 3 months enough of a sort of a moratorium? And of course, KNC Miner doesn't control the entire market, so there could be other companies that come out and release powerful devices in that time frame where they're sort of not shipping any units to make sure that their customers can get a return. Is that enough? They're positioning themselves as a very powerful force in Bitcoin mining and saying, look, we're being responsible. We're gonna hold off voluntarily during these 3 months to make sure people get a return. I guess I just want to talk about this. What do you guys think?
I think this is fantastic. It reminds me of a similar organization which helps organize commodity prices to ensure there's no market glut. I believe it's called OPEC. And so I can imagine this would be the OHEC, the Organization of Hashing Exporting Companies. And what they would do is they would organize in order to restrict supply and to make sure that no one company produced more than their quota. Is that a good word? Quota. Yes, they're exporting quota. And then use that to stabilize market prices. What could possibly go wrong?
So this is a hash rate cartel. Here's what you're saying.
Well, I mean, the announcement sounded almost exactly like the kind of announcement that Saudi Arabia puts out every 6 months, saying that their fields are good, their hashing power in the ground is good, and they're going to trickle it out to users on a sustained schedule to be responsible producers of petroleum. This is no different than OPEC, really. It is. What happens is that along comes some nut job, let's call it Saddam, and Saddam miners goes out and floods the market with hashing power, ignoring the evil OPEC cartel. And what's KNC miners said they're going to do then? Oh, right. Yes, they're going to sell as fast as their competitors if they don't play with this cartel game, in order to respectfully ensure that their customers don't miss out on the market opportunities. So, yeah, we know how well this is going to work. We've seen it. If it does work temporarily, then what happens is you have a supply crisis. I believe we had one here in 1973.
The real wild card in this is if any other companies are going to be able to break the cartel and compete with them, right? And put out other devices within the time frame so that they really don't have this much power in the marketing devices.
Well, I think history tells us that these types of cartels don't last very long. And the reason they don't last very long is because they pit the self-interest of the producing companies against their stated objectives, and eventually one of them crumbles. So it's really not a sustainable solution, which is why I'm concerned about volatility in the hashing power, because essentially when you see examples of people trying to put cartels together in order to control the supply of hashing, that tells you that they're not trusting that the marketplace will provide smooth transitions.
You know, immediately looking at this, the thing that strikes me is that this exactly reinforces the point that we've been making over and over again, that ASICs, while they might be good for certain participants in the market, namely people who make ASICs, for people who are trying to use ASICs as a way to increase their mining power, it's a really, I mean, there's no winning this game unless you have unlimited money to throw at it. We've seen now, I mean, this statement lays out, it doesn't lay out what the worst case scenario is, but it certainly lays out what the best case scenario is. That's people who have pre-ordered these devices, receive these devices, and then get a whopping 3 months to try to profit from that, you know, on the assumption that everybody decides to voluntarily play ball with, like you guys said, this cartel sort of attempt, when I think that we know pretty conclusively that with all the various players in the market, that's not going to be the case. And, you know, as fast as this technology is progressing, it's in none of the company's best interests to hold it back and not continue offering the thing that is ever faster. It's the same thing we have right now, where you have the smallest units from Butterfly Labs that were pre-ordered a year ago. There's still oftentimes, people are still waiting to receive those. And yet the generations of technology, we're at least 2 generations ahead of those at this point. It's like the USB eruptors, the little ASICs on a stick. You know, that's great if you can throw unlimited money at it and you're comfortable upgrading your equipment every couple of months because that's what's required to be competitive. But I don't think that's what most people who are buying ASICs think they're getting into when they make that pre-order purchase.
I can just see the future right now. In a decade or so, ASIC miners have become 100 million times more powerful. KNC miners decides to put an embargo on U.S. customers, and the U.S. government discovers weapons of mass hashing and invades Sweden. You know, don't be cynical. They're not invading for their hashing power. They're implementing regime change to liberate the Swedish people.
Well, you know, I mean,
it's for freedom.
The flip side of that, though, is that I don't think that it's even possible to have a situation like that here because there isn't the potential to monopolize. The problem is that on an individual by individual basis, you know, if you're an ASIC producing company or a oil producing nation in your example, then you have a lot of control there. But it's the users that are important, and since there's no limitation on who can manufacture these things, only who does manufacture these things, I don't really think you wind up with a situation where it can be controlled in that way. For me, it's not so much about that as it is about the fact that I don't feel like the marketing that is going along with ASIC devices really jives well with what the reality is. I think the marketing says that if you buy one of these, you can participate in mining on a high level. I think the reality is that if you buy one of these, you can participate on mining on a high level for a couple of months, and then pretty much you need to buy more hardware.
I do think that in the end, when this becomes advanced enough in terms of fab manufacturing, it will come down to very few who can actually make these devices.
Also, I'd be willing to bet a Bitcoin to either of you who wants to take me up on it. I think there's zero chance that they will go through with this and they will not continuously release their machines. I suspect that, again, like that clause at the end says, that if any of their competitors continue to add large amounts of hashing power, which we know is coming, they're just going to jump right in because they don't want to miss out on that opportunity as a company, not for their customers. The customers they're talking about are the ones who are going to buy more hardware, not the ones who've already sold it to.
I won't take that bet with you, Adam. Production-controlled cartels never work in the long run, and not even in the medium run. They only work for very short periods of time, and if they manage to create an embargo during that time, that's fine, but in the long run they don't, because they run contrary to the incentives of the people running them.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. If you'd like to contribute topics, questions, or comments, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/Reddit. We're going to try and use this as much as possible, and submissions with more upvotes from other listeners will make it onto the show much faster than sending an email. Thanks to everyone who provided content or music for this episode. And thanks to you, the listener, for listening. See you next time.